In the name of our loving and ever-present God. Amen. Go ahead and click your seatbelts on, because we got a lot to cover today, and we're going to kind of move kind of quick. First things first, the story of Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 through 20. The story of Samuel, where does that fall in this history of the children of God? Where does that story come in the scheme of things? Okay, it's not Genesis, it's not Exodus, it's not Leviticus, or it's not Numbers, it's not Deuteronomy. So, what comes after that? You Bible scholars. Okay, so what comes after that? Stephanie, Baptist, raised. Are we talking about the story of beg your pardon?
Kings and prophets.
Well, kings and prophets, but what we have here is that transitional piece between Judges. Oh, I remember now. Judges. You remember Judges? Yeah. Not much, because you don't read much about Judges in this. We get it maybe once every 3 years or so. We get Judges going on. But this is the period in the life of the children of God, or the, quote, chosen people, that falls between that period of having come out of the land of Israel, out of Egypt into the land of Israel, and then you've got the Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, and got all the settling of that part of the world, and then you have the Judges, and the Judges was kind of I'm going to use a word which works in the 21st century. It probably wouldn't work so much, 2,500 or 3,000 years ago. It was a little inconsistent. The leadership of the Judges was a little bit spotty. Okay, it wasn't consistent. The people of Israel were beginning to clamor for what? What were they beginning to clamor for?
A king.
A king. A king. And in order to have a king, in the structure of a theological argument, how's that for a good cloudy morning statement? In the structure of a theological argument for a king, if you are talking about the children of God, what you have to put in place first is the element of God and how God operates, and how out of God's largesse the kingships are formed. And here's the beginning of that. Boy, that took me a while to get there, didn't it? Here's the beginning of that, because Samuel is a prophet. He is a prophet. There have been other, quote, prophets, but he is the beginning of the lineage of prophets. The beginning of the lineage of prophets, which are formative to the nation states of in those days, the kingdom of Judah and Israel. So Samuel is there, and he's a little boy, and he's being called. He's being called. And he's got, I love this story, and I love the beginning of Isaiah. We talked about it a little bit with Linda and Aaron on Wednesday night with our lectionary study. That you get a kind of a similar story. We all stand and we sing that wonderful, "Here I am, Lord, is it I, Lord," etc., etc. Usually you join in by the second phrase. Nobody joined in because you didn't realize how far I was going. Never mind. But just in both of these instances, Samuel was called to bring about changes that would tickle the ears of the people of Israel. To tickle the ears of the people of Israel. And one of the first things he had to do was to go to this wonderful, wonderful, old, patriarchal kind of leader, keeper of the faith, Eli. And to tell Eli that because you didn't rein in the behavior of your sons, y'all are in big trouble. And you will pay. And there's nothing you can do. There is nothing you can do. You can't take your bullock to the altar of sacrifice and undo this like everybody else can. Because the nature of what you did was wrong. And you can look up in your own Bible what the boys did that was wrong, but it was pretty bad. Pretty bad. So you have that Samuel calling, and the first thing he does is he has to bring the bad news, the bad news to Eli and his family. And then, let's scroll forward to that wonderful Psalm 139. We don't have all of it, but we have some really good bits of Psalm 139. Really good bits of 139, where God knows us, and God understands us better than we understand ourselves. God knows us before we know ourselves. Maybe God understood Isaiah better than Isaiah understood himself, because Isaiah likewise, remember, the first thing right after, "Here I am, Lord, here I am," Isaiah says, and the coals of fire come down on his lips, and he's able to then speak the words of God. And the first thing he does is he goes out to Holy Trinity and he says, y'all need to keep your ears quiet and your tongues. We need to silence your tongue and close your ears to the message of God. Well, he didn't say it to Holy Trinity. He said it actually to the children of Israel. But that would be kind of a shocking thing for me to get up one morning and tell you on a Sunday. That wouldn't work. Jim, I don't get that. Well, Psalm 139, I've known you since before you existed. I've known you since before you existed. And then we have that kind of a thing that Paul is talking about. What is all this with the fornication stuff? I don't want to get up on a Sunday morning and talk about that, and I don't want to talk about prostitutes, etc., etc. But Paul does. Paul does. Paul does. And I want to kind of bind that a little bit together with the gospel. Not because they're related. Remember, those two are unrelated. They're unrelated. They're only related in the sense that Paul is a person who is advocating for a Christian way of viewing the world. And then 60 or 70 years later, we have this person who we call John doing the same thing. Doing the same thing. Advocating for this Christian viewpoint. Today I want to offer you something that I find extremely valuable. It may not be useful to you immediately, but I think that you might find it valuable too. And that is that God truly does know who you are at your deepest level. God knows who you are at your deepest level. God understands you at your deepest level. There are no aspects of who you are. There are no aspects of who you are that you can hide from God. There are none. There are none. I had a big thing. I'm going to get a little personal. I hope you don't mind. I had a big thing. I had inside of me for any number of years, I had this black hole. A black hole, and actually that's a good word for it, because almost everything that I did was drawn into it and crushed by it. But I had this black hole inside of me. And when you have a black hole inside of you, what that does is that it keeps you from being in a good and healthy relationship with anyone. And that includes God, when you think you have a black hole inside of you. Because what you do is you let people in just so far, and then you realize, oh my goodness, they're getting close to this black hole, and if they touch it, they will either turn to stone or they will run, or they will be wounded by this blackness, this ugliness that is inside of me. And you carry these things. I carried this thing for I don't know how many years I carried this thing. And then I told you the story about how there was a relationship I had with Stephanie, and I began to wonder what it was that she carried, and I wanted a part of that, and I was beginning to learn. And then one day I was standing in a Presbyterian church. I was called there as a North Carolina visiting artist to sing in the choir and look after them and help them with their music. And I'm sitting up in the choir loft, and Neil Bain was the pastor there, and he called Tony up. They're getting ready to distribute the communion. They're getting ready to distribute the communion, and Neil Bain said to Tony, "Remember, Tony, If you were the only sinner in the world, Christ would have come and died for you. That shell, that darkness inside of me, I would like to say that it evaporated that moment, but it didn't. What did happen, though, was that there was an opening in it. Because that opening in it was such that I began to realize that I could let this out. I could let this out. And over a period of time, the work that I did, I was able to come to an understanding that there's absolutely nothing about me, there was absolutely nothing about anyone that I know, there was nothing about anything I've ever done that wasn't already acknowledged by the power and presence of a loving God. And I became free. I became free. I was liberated that very day. The beginning of my liberation began that day. And the sound of the voice of God in my ear became louder and real. Because Paul is talking about, in Paul's letter to the 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about that darkness within us. That's what Paul's talking about. He's using the word fornication, and he's talking about this issue of binding it with prostitute, and all of that's the language that Paul is using. But Paul is talking about that ugliness, or the thing that we have inside us that we do not want God to see. We don't want the experiences that we've had to become manifest to God. And Psalm 139 tells us that God understands. There was a time in my life when I was walking along the seashore, figuratively speaking, and Jesus called me. And he used the name that I was given at birth. He called me Jimmy. But he understood who this little boy was and what that little boy grew up to be. He understood that. Just as he understands everything about you. In the Gospel of John, he's calling Philip. Philip is calling Nathaniel. Nathaniel is calling Shlomo. Shlomo is calling Mariam. Mariam is calling Lori. And Lori is calling Dan. And Dan is calling Keith. And Keith is calling. How did you know me? How did you know me? Did you know me because you saw me somewhere? I knew you because I am the manifestation of a loving and ever-present God. I knew you. I know you. I know your name. I know what hurts you. I know what enlivens you. I know what enriches you. And I will die for that. I will give up my life for that.